On page 5 and 6 of our Unit 1 notes, we look at using flow charts to help us understand equations that are unusual or that are the source of common mistakes. For example, if we look at this first equation, 4 minus 2x equals 6, generally in a two-step equation, when there is subtraction, we would add our constant, so we would add 4 to both sides. And that would not be the correct move here, because if we added 4 to both sides, we would end up with 8 minus 2x equals 10, which would not help us out. If you're able to solve this algebraically in problems like this, then flowcharts are not necessary. They're not required. I will never require you to use a flowchart on an assessment. However, a lot of students find them really helpful. So here's how a flowchart works. We look at our equation and we focus on our variable and we see what operations are being performed on that variable and in what order. So when we start with x, the first thing that we do according to PEMDAS, our order of operations, is we multiply x by -2. That gives us -2x. The next thing that's done to x is we add 4. So that we have -2x plus 4, which is the same as 4 minus 2x. And then we get to our equal sign, which means we're done. -2x plus 4, which is the same as 4 minus 2x, equals 6. And then I retrace my steps using inverse operations, but in the reverse order. So if I look above, I was adding 4. So now instead of adding 4, I'm going to subtract 4. 6 minus 4 is 2. And then finally, instead of multiplying by -2, I'm going to divide by -2. That gives me my final answer of -1. Now that thought process can help me over here. The bottom row of my flowchart can show me which steps I should be performing and in what order for my algebraic process. So the first thing that I want to do is subtract 4. That gives me -2x equals 2. And then finally, I divide by -2. That gives me x equals -1. So this would be the algebraic solution. And I could just use my flowchart to help me understand how to get there. Another frequent mistake that flowcharts can help me with is these two equations, x divided by 2 plus 4 equals -6 versus x plus 4 divided by 2 equals -6. These are frequently confused equations for students who have just memorized first you add or subtract and then you multiply or divide. That works in this case. I subtract and then I multiply. And that is the correct solution. X does equal -20, which I see if I plug it back in. -20 divided by 2 is -10, plus 4 is -6. However, if I performed those same operations on this equation and I arrived at -20, that would not work. -20 plus 4 divided by 2 would be -16 divided by 2, which is -8, and that would not be a correct solution. So here's how the flowchart can help me understand the difference between these two equations. In the top equation, the first thing that's being done to x, focusing on that x, always starting with x, is that I divide by 2, and that gives me x divided by 2. The second thing being done to x is I add 4. That gives me x divided by 2 plus 4. And then I get to my equal sign, so I'm done. X divided by 2 plus 4 equals -6. Now I want to unwrap that variable, retracing my steps in the opposite order using inverse operations. So the opposite of adding 4 is subtracting 4. -6 minus 4 is -10. And then the opposite of dividing by 2 is multiplying by 2, which gives me -20, which corresponds with my algebraic solution. This is in contrast to the second equation when instead of dividing by 2 first, x plus 4 is in the top of that fraction bar, so I add 4 first. I have x plus 4. The next operation being performed is I'm dividing by 2, so I have x plus 4 divided by 2. Again, I'm at the equal sign. That equals -6. And now when I retrace my steps, I know that I need to multiply by 2 first and then subtract 4, giving me a final answer of negative 16. Again, I can use this bottom row of my flow chart to help me solve the equation algebraically. So my first step, times 2, leaves me with x plus 4 equals negative 12. My second step, subtracting 4, gives me x equals negative 16. Now if I were to plug that in, negative 16 plus 4 is negative 12, divided by 2 is negative 6, and that works. Again, flowcharts are not required. If they are not helpful to you, do not force yourself to struggle with them, but they are helpful to many students, and if they are, great.